The Ocean Liner Murders, A Sherlock Holmes Mystery Year, 1899. Chapter 1. A Bell in the Small Hours. The bell that woke the Caledonic that morning was not the ship's bell at all, but a fist against a cabin door, and then a steward's voice rising from politeness into panic. I did not hear it myself. I had it afterward from the steward, a narrow, anxious man named Alfie Doggett, who told the tale so many times over the following days that he had worn it smooth, like a coin passed hand to hand. Sir Julius Harker had asked, the first night out from Southampton, that his morning tea be brought at 7 precisely, and not a minute before. He was a man of exact habits, and exact men do not miss their tea. On the 4th morning, the tea grew cold outside the door of cabin 9, and no voice answered the knock. Doggett knocked again, then called through the panel, then pressed his ear to the wood, and heard, he swore, nothing at all, not breathing, not the creak of a berth, not even the small sounds a ship makes settling into a swell. He fetched the second officer, a fair-haired young man called Thomas Prynne, who fetched the master key, and the two of them let themselves into cabin 9 at 7 minutes past 7 in the morning. Sir Julius Harker lay in his berth as though he had simply gone to sleep and declined to wake. His hands were folded on the counterpane, his spectacles sat on the little shelf beside him, folded with their usual precision. The porthole was screwed shut against the weather, the curtain drawn, the door, Prynne would swear to this before witnesses, locked from the inside, the key still standing in its barrel. There was no wound on him, no blood, no mark of violence, no sign that any hand but his own had touched anything in that cabin. The ship's surgeon, a soft-spoken man named Miles Sutter, was summoned within the quarter hour. He examined the body with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this work many times before, and he pronounced, with evident regret, that Sir Julius Harker, 61 years of age, a stout man fond of his port and his cigars, had died in the night of a failure of the heart. It was, Dr. Sutter said, entirely unsurprising in a gentleman of his years and his habits. The captain, a heavy, weathered man named Ross Aldous, was inclined to agree, and inclined besides to hope the matter might be closed before it troubled his passengers or his owners. It might have ended there. A quiet death, a quiet burial at sea, or a quiet transfer to New York in the ship's ice room. Had not Mrs. Adeline Fenwick, the dead man's niece and travelling companion, come to my friend Sherlock Holmes 2 mornings before, white-faced and low-voiced, to tell him she believed her uncle was afraid of something, and that she did not think he would live to see New York. Holmes had listened to her then with the same courteous, faintly bored attention he gave to most such confidences, and had told me afterward that he expected nothing more than a family quarrel over money. He was wrong, and he did not enjoy being wrong, and it was that irritation, I think, quite as much as the mystery itself, that carried us both into the strangest case of our Atlantic crossing. Chapter 2. 2 Restful Travellers. We had come aboard the Caledonic at Southampton for no more sinister reason than my own health, which had been unsettled since a bout of low fever that spring, and my wife's insistence that a sea voyage would mend what London fogs had frayed. Holmes had come, he claimed, purely to keep me company, though I suspected he was quite as glad of the rest as I was, for the winter had brought him 3 wearying cases in succession, and left him thin and short-tempered in a way that only idleness could cure. For the first 2 days he was, by his own standards, almost content. He paced the promenade deck at all hours, smoked more than his physician would have liked, and entertained himself, in the absence of any crime to occupy him, by reading his fellow passengers as another man might read a newspaper. On the second evening, over the soup, he startled a retired colonel at our table by remarking that the gentleman had until recently kept a large dog, had lately lost money at cards to a man he disliked, and had been a cavalry officer rather than infantry. The colonel, when he had recovered his composure, admitted all three were true, and demanded to know how it was done. "Your left cuff, Colonel, is worn in a particular pattern that comes only from a habit of scratching a dog behind the ears with that hand," Holmes said. "Your watch chain has a small hollow polish mark, where a fob once hung and hangs no longer, sold rather suddenly, I think, and not by choice. And your bearing, if you will forgive me, is that of a man more used to a horse beneath him than his own two boots." I record this trifling scene not because it bears upon the case, but because it was, in its way, the last carefree evening of the voyage, and because it showed Holmes at his most delighted, a delight that would curdle, within 2 days, into something far grimmer. It was the next morning that Mrs. Adeline Fenwick sought him out. She was perhaps 30 years of age, dark-haired, composed in the manner of a woman raised to composure rather than born to it, and she found Holmes alone at the rail, watching the grey Atlantic swell go by. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am told you are a detective, and I would not trouble you if I had anyone else to ask." She explained, in a low voice and with frequent glances over her shoulder, that her uncle, Sir Julius Harker, had received 2 letters since they left Bombay. One in Southampton before they sailed, one slipped beneath the door of his cabin only the previous night, and that both had left him shaken in a way she had never before seen in a man she described as otherwise entirely without nerves. "He would not show them to me," she said. "He burned the first in the grate at our hotel, and the second in the cabin lamp not an hour after he read it. But I saw enough of the second, Mr. Holmes, before he thrust it into the flame, to read 3 words, 'I have not forgotten.'" Holmes asked her a dozen quiet questions, of her uncle's history, of his years in India, of his enemies, of his health, of any recent change in his habits, and she answered each as fully as she could, though it was plain she knew less of her uncle's past than a niece might be expected to know. Sir Julius, she said, had been a magistrate in Bombay for many years before retiring wealthy, though she could not say precisely how a magistrate's salary had produced so large a fortune. He spoke rarely of that time, and never with pleasure. "Has he any enemies aboard this ship, do you suppose?" Holmes asked her. "I should have said he had no enemies at all a week ago," she answered. "Now I hardly know what to think. Holmes told me that evening, over his pipe, that he suspected nothing worse than an old debt or an old scandal come back to embarrass a proud man, and that he intended to watch the matter idly rather than pursue it. A threatening letter is a common enough thing, Watson, and most of them come to nothing but an unpleasant supper. He was, as I have said, wrong, and the tea growing cold outside cabin 9, 2 mornings later, proved it. Chapter 3. The Locked Cabin. Captain Aldous did not want Sherlock Holmes anywhere near cabin 9, and said so, plainly, within an hour of the body's discovery. It was Mrs. Fenwick who insisted, white and shaking but entirely resolute, that the man her uncle had feared enough to burn 2 letters over had not died merely of an unlucky heart, and that Mr. Holmes, whom she now named openly as a consulting detective of some reputation, should be permitted to look at the room before anything in it was disturbed further. The captain gave way with poor grace, on the condition that Dr. Sutter remain present throughout, and that nothing whatever be removed from the cabin without his own consent. Holmes went over that small room as I have seen him go over 100 rooms before, on hands and knees at times, his lens an inch from the carpet, silent for so long that the captain grew visibly restless, and Dr. Sutter shifted his weight from foot to foot beside the door. The key, Holmes noted aloud, stood in the lock on the inside, turned fully, and the door itself showed no mark of forcing. The porthole was screwed down with 4 brass thumbscrews, all 4 seated firm, and a film of salt crust upon them suggested they had not been touched in days. "A locked room, gentlemen, in the fullest sense of the phrase," Holmes said, and I confess the words gave me an unpleasant chill, for I had read of such cases in the criminal annals and knew how rarely they proved to be what they seemed. He turned his attention to the body itself, which had not yet been moved to the ice room, and Dr. Sutter walked him through his own examination, with the patient courtesy of one professional deferring, not unwillingly, to another. There was no wound, no bruise, no mark of a struggle. The pupils, Sutter observed, were somewhat contracted, which he attributed to the man's age and the lamp's proximity. Holmes asked to see the medicine cabinet fixed to the cabin wall, and there found a small brown bottle of chloral hydrate, prescribed, the label read, by a Bombay physician for Sir Julius's sleeplessness. He took it regularly? Holmes asked. Every night, I am told, said Sutter, a common enough habit among gentlemen who have kept irregular hours in a hot climate. Holmes held the bottle to the light, turned it, and set it down with an expression I knew well, the flat, unreadable calm that meant he had seen something and did not intend to say what. He asked next after the dead man's watch, and Mrs. Fenwick, summoned to the door, confirmed at once that her uncle wound it every night without exception, the very last act before he blew out his lamp, a habit so fixed that she had teased him for it more than once. The watch, taken now from the nightstand, had stopped, and stood at 11 minutes past 10. He was seen alive after that hour, the captain said at once. Doggett brought him a glass of soda water at 10:30, and spoke with him through the door. Then either Doggett is mistaken in the hour, Holmes said quietly, or Sir Julius Harker did not wind his own watch that night, a habit, by his niece's account, he had never once broken in years. And a man does not break so fixed a habit, Captain, unless something has already gone very wrong with his evening before 10 o'clock struck. He said nothing further in the cabin, but I saw him glance once, briefly and without any particular emphasis, at Dr. Sutter's hands, strong, well-kept, a surgeon's hands, before he rose and asked that the room be sealed until he had finished his inquiries. Chapter 4. Threads from Bombay. We took our coffee that afternoon in a quiet corner of the smoking room, and Holmes laid before me, in that clipped, rapid way he had when a case had genuinely caught him, the threads he meant to follow. A watch unwound, Watson, is a small thing, but small things are my trade. Either Doggett lied about the 10:30 soda water, and I see no reason yet why he should, or Sir Julius was already dead, or dying, or beyond caring for his watch, well before the hour the ship's company believes him to have retired. And the chloral, a man who takes his sleeping draught every night for years, develops a very particular relationship with the bottle, Watson. He knows its weight in his hand before he has poured a drop. That bottle in cabin 9 is fuller than a nightly dose for a week's use ought to leave it. Fuller, unless my eye deceives me, than it should be even allowing for a single night's dose taken as usual. You think it was not drunk? I think, said Holmes, that whatever killed Sir Julius Harker did not come from that bottle at all, though I expect our good Dr. Sutter to find traces of chloral in the body all the same, and to conclude, not unreasonably, that the man simply took an unlucky double dose. It is the explanation that requires the least imagination, and for that reason it will satisfy the captain admirably. He was, I should say here, entirely correct in that prediction, for Sutter's fuller examination that evening did find traces of chloral, and Captain Aldous seized upon it with the relief of a man glad to close a troubling file. Holmes had no such relief. That afternoon he sought out Mrs. Fenwick again, and drew from her, gently but persistently, the history her uncle had never cared to tell. Sir Julius Harker had gone out to Bombay as a young man of 26, had risen through the judicial service with a speed that surprised his colleagues, and had, in the year 1885, presided over a case that made some noise at the time, the trial of a young bank clerk named Aldous Wren, accused of embezzling a very large sum from the trading house that employed him. Wren was convicted, Mrs. Fenwick said. I remember my uncle speaking of it once, years ago, with more satisfaction than I thought the matter deserved. He said the fellow had been clever, but not clever enough, and that justice had been served, though it broke a family to pieces in the doing. Broke a family how? Holmes asked. Wren's mother, I believe, did not long survive the disgrace, and there was a younger brother, still a boy at the time, who I understand left India altogether rather than live under the name. Holmes sat very still for a moment, the way a hunting dog goes still at a scent. Wren himself, what became of him? Transported, I believe, for a term of years. I do not know if he is living now or dead. And the younger brother's name? Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. I never heard it. My uncle spoke of the family only the once, and never again, though I recall he seemed, in later years, oddly uneasy whenever the case was mentioned by others, as though the memory sat less comfortably with him as time passed. Holmes thanked her and said nothing more that afternoon, but I saw him take out his notebook that evening and write, in his small, cramped hand, a single line I glimpsed over his shoulder. A boy who changed his name does not forget his brother's face in the dock. Chapter 5. An Evening in the Saloon. It is easy, looking back upon those 9 days, to imagine the Caledonic as a vessel given over entirely to murder and suspicion from the moment we boarded her at Southampton. In truth, for the first 3 evenings, she was nothing more sinister than any well-appointed liner crossing a grey autumn Atlantic, a floating hotel of some 400 souls, dining, dancing, gossiping, and complaining of the swell, entirely unaware of the quiet tragedy already gathering somewhere among them. I have always found ships' saloons instructive places, for they compress into a single evening's dining the whole small society of a nation, the retired officer, the ambitious tradesman, the clergyman travelling to a new parish, the widow seeking a change of air, the young couple whose fortunes have not yet been decided. Holmes, for his part, found the saloon instructive for rather different reasons, and spent the better part of that third evening watching the room with the unhurried attention he generally reserved for a crime scene, rather than a dinner table. It was there that I first noticed, without at the time attaching any particular weight to it, a certain coolness between Sir Julius Harker and a heavy-set, florid gentleman named Edmund Carow, who I understood to be a partner in a Bombay trading concern, and by his own loud account over cigars, a man of considerable means. The two exchanged perhaps a dozen words across the width of the saloon that evening, all of them clipped, and Carow's eyes followed Harker afterward, with an expression I might, in a less eventful week, have taken for nothing more than ordinary commercial rivalry. There was also aboard a certain Reverend Josiah Blake, a thin, grey, gentle-mannered clergyman travelling out to take up a parish in New Jersey, who struck me, on that third evening, as rather the most restful company at our end of the table, full of small, harmless observations about the weather and the psalms appointed for Sunday, and entirely without, so far as I could then judge, any darker business to occupy his thoughts. "You are cataloguing the room, Watson. I can see it in your face," Holmes said to me quietly, as the stewards cleared the fish course. "A commendable habit in a chronicler, though I fear you catalogue rather more kindly than the facts always warrant. You suspect Mr. Carow of something already." "I suspect Mr. Carow of disliking Sir Julius Harker a good deal more heartily than good manners generally permit a fellow passenger to show at a dinner table, which is interesting chiefly because I have not yet been told why, and a dislike without a stated cause is always worth a detective's patience, Watson, whether or not it ever proves to matter." It did prove, in the fullness of time, to matter rather less to the central mystery than Holmes's careful attention to it that evening might have suggested, though I record it here because it occupied no small part of our first day's inquiry, and because the truth behind it, when it finally emerged, cast an unexpectedly harsh light upon the dead man's character that coloured everything we later learned of him. Holmes drew Caro into conversation himself the following morning, over the pretext of a shared interest in Bombay trade figures, and came away from that hour's talk with a thoughtful, closed expression I had learned to associate with a fact freshly filed away rather than fully understood. Caro and Harker were partners once, Watson, in a scheme to develop certain cotton warehouses along the Bombay docks some 8 years ago, a scheme that failed disastrously and cost a good many smaller investors their savings, while Harker himself, by every account Caro was willing to give me, emerged from the wreck a good deal richer than he went into it. You think Harker cheated him? I think Caro believes so most passionately, and has believed it for 8 years without ever finding proof enough to bring the matter before a court, or even before Bombay's rather forgiving society. A man nursing an unprovable grievance for 8 years is not, on the face of it, so very different from a man nursing an unprovable grievance for 14, and I confess the parallel troubled me rather more, in those first days, than I later allowed myself to admit. It was this parallel, indeed, that led Holmes to examine Caro's own movements on the night of the murder, with a thoroughness scarcely less careful than the attention he would later turn upon Dr. Sutter, an examination that produced, in the end, nothing more damning than a perfectly ordinary evening spent losing £4 at whist in the company of 3 witnesses who could vouch for him past midnight, and a bitterness that had, whatever its private satisfactions, never once translated into any plan more concrete than sullen silence across a dinner table. I mention Reverend Blake, too, only to record that Holmes questioned him, gently and in passing, and learned nothing more remarkable than that the clergyman had once, many years before, exchanged a few words with Sir Julius Harker at a missionary society dinner in London, and remembered him chiefly for having monopolized the port. It was, Holmes told me afterward with something close to amusement, the single most thoroughly innocent conversation the whole voyage produced, and he was, on the whole, rather glad of it. Not every man aboard a doomed ship need carry a secret worth killing for, Watson, however much a storyteller's instinct might wish it otherwise. Some men are exactly as harmless as they appear, and it does no discredit to my methods to find, now and again, that a perfectly ordinary clergyman is nothing more than a perfectly ordinary clergyman. Chapter 6. The Card-Sharp's Temper. It was Inspector Grail, a stout, unhurried Scotland Yard man returning from an extradition matter in New York, who brought the next thread to Holmes's attention, and did so with the particular satisfaction of a professional who believes he has solved a puzzle before the amateur beside him. "You needn't trouble yourself further, Mr. Holmes," he said over brandy that evening, in a voice pitched to carry rather further than perhaps he intended. "I had it from 3 separate passengers this afternoon. Sir Julius quarrelled, publicly and loudly, with a Mr. Corrin Vane on the very night he died, over cards, and no small sum of money either. Mr. Corrin Vane was a lean, handsome man of perhaps 40, well-dressed, well-spoken, and possessed of the particular smoothness that I have learned, through long acquaintance with Holmes's cases, to regard with immediate suspicion. He did not deny the quarrel when Holmes sought him out the next morning, though he told the tale with the wounded dignity of a man convinced he had been wronged twice over, first at cards, and now by gossip. "Harker owed me £200 by the end of that hand, and welched on it before witnesses," Vane said. "I told him plainly what I thought of a magistrate, mark you, who would not honour a gaming debt. We parted at perhaps 9:45, and I never saw the man again." "10:15, Holmes repeated. "You are certain of the hour?" The smoking-room clock struck the quarter as I left it. "I am not in the habit of losing track of time when I am angry, Mr. Holmes. Quite the reverse." It was, on the surface, the most promising thread the case had yet produced. A public quarrel, a substantial debt, a proud man humiliated before witnesses, and a victim who died that same night behind a locked door. Inspector Grail declared himself entirely satisfied, and even Captain Aldous, who had disliked the whole business of an impossible murder, seemed visibly relieved to have so ordinary a suspect to consider. Holmes, however, was not satisfied, and said so to me privately that night with some irritation. "It fits too neatly, Watson, and things that fit too neatly in the first day of an inquiry generally turn out to have been arranged to fit that way by somebody with an interest in the arranging. You think Vane innocent? I think Vane is exactly the sort of man a clever murderer would be glad to see quarrelling loudly with his victim the same evening he meant to kill him," Holmes said. "A locked door defeats an ordinary temper, Watson. A man in a rage does not pick locks, he breaks them, or he does not trouble with locks at all. Whoever killed Sir Julius Harker did so with a cold and steady hand, and Mr. Vane, whatever his faults, does not strike me as a cold man." He would say no more that night, but I noticed, over the following 2 days, that while Inspector Grail devoted his energies entirely to establishing Vane's movements after the quarrel, Holmes spent his own time elsewhere, in quiet conversation with the ship's stewards, in the ship's small library poring over old shipping line passenger lists, and once, for the better part of an hour, in what appeared to be idle conversation with Dr. Miles Sutter about nothing more sinister than the treatment of seasickness. Chapter 7. A Question of Handwriting. There remained, throughout those early days, the small, unresolved matter of the 2 burned letters Mrs. Fenwick had described to Holmes before her uncle's death, and it was to this thread that Holmes turned his attention the morning after Vane's quarrel had become common knowledge throughout the ship. The first letter, received at their Southampton hotel, had been burned entirely away in the grate before Mrs. Fenwick ever saw more than its outer cover. The second, however, the one containing the 3 words I have not forgotten, had been thrust so hastily into the cabin lamp that a small unburned corner had fallen unnoticed to the floor, where Mrs. Fenwick had found it 2 days later while tidying her uncle's effects, and had kept it, without quite knowing why, folded inside her own writing case. She produced it for Holmes that morning with evident reluctance, as though the scrap of paper itself carried some of the dread its message had first inspired. Holmes examined it under his lens for a long while in silence, a corner perhaps 2 inches square, charred along one edge, bearing the ends of 4 lines of a small, careful, unhurried hand, none of them containing more than a word or 2 still legible. The tale of Forgotten, a fragment that might have been Bombay, or might have been some other word entirely, and, most tantalizing of all, 3 letters at the very edge of the tier that could only be the beginning of a signature: M.S., M for Miles Watson, and S for whatever name he then chose to sign himself. It is not proof, for a man's initials are common property, and I would not care to hang a case upon 2 burned letters alone, but it agrees, and agreement is what I have been gathering, piece by patient piece, since Mrs. Fenwick first came to me at the rail. He turned next, with a thoroughness, I confess, struck me at the time as almost excessive, given the fragment's slightness, to the paper itself, its weight, its faint ruling, the particular ash it had left when burned, comparing it under his lens against samples he had quietly gathered. Over the preceding 2 days, from the writing desks of every likely suspect the ship afforded, procured through means so unobtrusive that not one of those from whom he obtained them ever suspected the purpose of his idle requests for a sheet of notepaper to jot down some trifling reminder. Ship's stationery, of the pattern supplied in the officer's own writing room rather than the passenger's saloon, Watson, a detail that narrows our field very considerably, for a passenger wishing to threaten Sir Julius Harker without discovery would hardly trouble to procure paper from a room he had no ordinary business entering, whereas a member of the crew, or a man whose professional duties gave him free and unremarked access to every quarter of the ship, would find such paper the most natural thing in the world to hand. He compared, too, the small fragment of handwriting itself against samples of Corin Vane's own hand, obtained readily enough from a marker Vane had signed at the card table, and against a note in Edmund Carrow's blunt, heavy script that Holmes procured on the pretext of a shared inquiry about shipping schedules, eliminating both, within the hour, with the same quiet, methodical thoroughness he brought to every other thread of the case. Neither hand answers to the fragment, Watson, which I confess disappoints Inspector Grail rather more than it disappoints me, for he had hoped, I think, to close his case upon Vane's temper without any further trouble to himself. The hand upon this scrap is careful, small, and unhurried. The hand, I should say, of a man trained to a certain steadiness by daily professional habit, rather than the hand of a gambler or a blustering tradesman. It was this small forensic thread, quite as much as the stopped watch or the fuller-than-expected chloral bottle, that first turned Holmes's settled attention toward the ship's medical quarters, though he was careful, even now, to voice no name aloud, preferring, as he told me plainly that evening, to gather every thread the physical evidence could yield before he allowed himself the luxury of a settled conviction. A theory formed too early, Watson, has an unfortunate habit of bending every fact it afterward encounters to fit itself, rather than bending itself to fit the facts. I have a strong suspicion now of where this case must lead. I do not yet have certainty, and I would rather walk the whole slow road to certainty than arrive at the right name by a lucky guess I cannot afterward defend. Chapter 8. A Watch That Would Not Wind. I pressed Holmes, on the third day after the discovery, to tell me plainly what he suspected, for his silences had begun to try even my long-tested patience. I suspect nothing yet that I can prove, Watson, and I dislike voicing a suspicion before I can prove it, for a spoken suspicion has a way of altering the behaviour of the person suspected, and I would very much rather our murderer continue to feel himself entirely safe a while longer. He would tell me only this much, that the stopped watch troubled him more than anything else in the case, for it fixed the hour of death, or at least the hour at which Sir Julius Harker ceased to be a man capable of his ordinary habits, well before the ship's company believed him dead. If Doggett spoke to a living man at 10:30 through that door, Holmes said, then either Doggett is a liar, or the voice he heard was not entirely Sir Julius's own mind speaking. A man deep in the first stupor of a powerful drug can often answer a simple question in a thick, sleepy voice and satisfy a steward who expects nothing more than a grunted acknowledgement. You think he was drugged before 10, then, and someone spoke through the door for him, or he answered in a stupor and died some hours later? I think, Watson, that the watch stopped at 11 minutes past 10 because that is very close to the true hour he lost the use of his hands and his mind together, whatever hour his body finally gave up its last breath. And that gap, between the hour a man is rendered helpless and the hour he is found dead, is exactly the gap in which a patient murderer does his quiet work and departs, locking the door behind him by some means I have not yet proved, though I believe I know it. I asked him what means he suspected, and he smiled, not pleasantly. An old trick, Watson, older than either of us, and one that any man with steady hands and a fine pair of forceps might manage without difficulty, given a key already standing in the lock and a keyhole of the old, generous Indian teak pattern, such as this ship's older cabins still carry. I tested the lock on cabin 9 myself this morning while the steward's back was turned. It can be done from outside in under a minute, by a steady hand, without breaking anything at all. A surgeon's hand, I said slowly, would be steady enough. Holmes did not answer that directly, though his silence was answer enough for me, familiar as I was with his habits. Inspector Grail, meanwhile, had grown so confident of Vane's guilt that he petitioned Captain Aldous that same afternoon to have the man confined to his cabin under guard until New York, a request the captain was disposed to grant, chiefly for the comfort of his other passengers. Holmes intervened, with some sharpness, insisting that no man be confined on evidence so circumstantial, and won, after an unpleasant quarter hour, only a grudging delay. Vane is innocent of this, Grail, whatever his other sins, Holmes told him afterward. And if you lock him away, you will only give our true murderer 3 more days of perfect safety in which to cover whatever traces remain. Grail was not persuaded, and told Holmes, not without some heat, that amateur theorizing was all very well, but that a magistrate's murder wanted a magistrate's evidence, and Vane's quarrel was evidence enough for any sensible jury. It was, as matters fell out within 24 hours, an argument events themselves would answer far more forcefully than Holmes's words had done. Chapter 9. The Second Knock. The second death came at night, as the first had, and it was again Alfie Doggett's fate to raise the alarm, though this time it was not a locked door he found, but an open one, swinging gently on its hinge with the roll of the ship, and a set of stairs leading down to the lower promenade deck, where the crew took their air after their watch. The body of the steward's own particular friend among the crew, a young trimmer named Hugh Marsh, who worked below in the engine spaces and had little natural business on the passenger decks at all, was found at the foot of those stairs a little before 6 in the morning, his neck broken, his face turned up toward the grey coming dawn. It might have passed, on a rolling ship in poor weather, for a wretched accident, a missed footing, a slipped hand on a wet rail, had not Doggett himself insisted, white and shaking worse than he had been over Sir Julius, that Marsh had told him only the evening before that he had found something belonging to the dead gentleman and meant to see what reward might be had for its return before he handed it over to the officers. He would not tell me what it was, Doggett said, wringing his cap in both hands before Holmes and the captain both, only that he had it safe and that it would surprise a good many people if it came to be known. Holmes went down those stairs himself within the hour, moving with a swiftness I had not seen in him since the case began, and examined both the body and the stairwell with an intensity that left even Captain Aldous silent and watchful beside him. "No accident, Captain," Holmes said at last, straightening from his examination of the dead man's hands. "Look here, a graze along the palm, fresh, and splinters from the rail driven into the flesh, in a direction that speaks of a hand thrown out to catch a fall already begun, not a hand that slipped by its own carelessness. And here, on the collar, the faint mark of 2 fingers pressed hard enough to bruise, already darkening beneath the skin, though the man has been dead but a few hours. You are saying he was pushed. I am saying he was seized from behind by someone strong enough and quick enough to break his neck against that rail before he could cry out, and that whoever did it knew exactly what Hugh Marsh had found and could not afford to let him live to sell it to the wrong ears. The find itself, whatever it had been, was nowhere on the body nor in Marsh's small locker below, which had plainly been searched already, and searched well, every seam of his few belongings turned out and left in disorder. Holmes's face, when he came up from that locker, wore an expression I had seen before only twice in our long friendship, a kind of controlled, cold fury that boded very ill indeed for whoever had earned it. "2 deaths now, Watson, not 1, he said, low enough that only I could hear him, "and a murderer clever enough to strike twice within the week and leave, on both occasions, almost nothing behind him. I begin to think we deal here with a man who has planned this crossing for a very long time indeed, and who will not stop at a 3rd death if a 3rd becomes necessary to his safety." Inspector Grail, summoned to the scene, went pale at the news and abandoned, for the first time, his confident insistence upon Vane's guilt, for Vane, confined that very night to his cabin under a steward's informal watch at Holmes's own late insistence, could not possibly have been the hand that broke Hugh Marsh's neck upon the lower deck. The ship's company took the second death a good deal harder than the first, I think, For a magistrate's quiet passing in his own birth is one thing, easily enough dressed up as an old man's misfortune, but a young sailor found broken at the foot of a stairway, his neck twisted by a stranger's hand, is a different and a colder terror altogether, one that spread through the crew's quarters that morning with a speed no officer's reassurance could entirely check. I heard, before the day was out, no fewer than 3 separate versions of the discovery already circulating below decks, each a little more embellished than the last, and Captain Aldous, ordinarily so contained a man, wore for the remainder of that voyage an expression of settled, private dread that never quite left him again. Holmes himself said little more that morning, though I saw him stand for a long while at the foot of those stairs after the body had at last been carried away, looking not down at the deck where Marsh had fallen, but up, along the dim passage above, toward the corridor from which a strong and silent hand must have come. 2 deaths in 4 days, Watson, upon a ship of some 400 souls, from which the murderer cannot yet have disembarked, cannot easily hide, and cannot, I think, much longer preserve the composure that has served him so well thus far. A frightened man grows either reckless or desperate as his hiding place shrinks about him, and I confess I do not know yet which of the 2 we are dealing with, though I mean to find out before a 3rd body gives either of us the answer, at a cost neither of us could forgive ourselves. Chapter 10. Old Debts, Old Lies. With Vane's alibi for the 2nd death now unshakable, the ship's small society of suspects opened out considerably, and Holmes spent the following day moving among them with a patient, unhurried thoroughness that tried the nerves of everyone aboard rather more than any outright accusation would have done. Mrs. Iris Wexley, a handsome widow of perhaps 45 travelling in the first-class cabins under the chaperonage of an elderly companion, proved, under Holmes's quiet questioning, to have known Sir Julius Harker rather better than she had at first admitted, an acquaintance, she confessed at last, that dated to Bombay some 14 years before, and had once been a good deal warmer than acquaintance generally implies. "He threatened to write to my husband once, Mr. Holmes, though my husband has been dead these 6 years, and the threat could do me no harm any longer," she said, with a bitterness that had plainly outlived the affair itself by a decade. "I dare say he threatened a great many people with a great many things, over the years. It was rather a habit of his." Second Officer Prynne, questioned separately, admitted with evident embarrassment to a clandestine understanding with Mrs. Fenwick herself, an attachment her late uncle had forbidden absolutely, on grounds Prynne described only as his own notions of what my prospects were worth, a motive, Holmes noted privately to me, that gave the young officer means, through his master key, and a grievance besides, though nothing in his open, anxious manner suggested the cold hand that had done the actual killing. Mrs. Fenwick herself, questioned again, wept for the first time since her uncle's death, and admitted that she had sometimes wished, in her most unguarded moments, that her uncle's disapproval might simply cease to trouble her, a confession Holmes received with unusual gentleness, and set aside, I could see, almost at once as the ordinary unhappiness of an unhappy young woman, rather than the confession of a murderer. It was Dr. Sutter who occupied the greater part of Holmes's attention that day, though he did so with such an appearance of idle professional friendliness that even I, who knew him well, did not at first grasp how closely my friend was watching every word the surgeon offered. Sutter spoke readily enough of his own history, a childhood in Kent, medical training in Edinburgh, some years in general practice before he took to the sea for his health and his temperament both. He had never, he said plainly, set foot in India in his life. "A pity," Holmes observed, watching him closely. Sir Julius's history there was colourful enough to interest any physician of an inquiring turn of mind. A case in '85, I understand, that made a certain noise even in London papers at the time, the Wren embezzlement matter. I watched Sutter's face as Holmes spoke that name, and I will swear to this day that something crossed it, brief, controlled, gone almost before it had properly arrived, before he answered, in a voice as level as before, that he had never heard of the case at all. Curious, Holmes said afterward, when Sutter had gone, that a man should control his face so very well at the mention of a name he claims never to have heard, Watson. A stranger's name provokes, at most, polite incomprehension. That name provoked something rather closer to old pain, swiftly buried. Chapter 11. Old partners Edmund Carow, questioned again in light of what Mrs. Fenwick had told us of her uncle's Bombay history, proved rather more forthcoming on this second occasion than he had been at our first idle conversation over trade figures, and I think the days of shipboard suspicion had by then worn down whatever discretion he might otherwise have maintained. I do not mind telling you plainly, Mr. Holmes, now the man is dead, that I believed Julius Harker a scoundrel of the first water, and I believe it still, he said, over a private glass of port in the smoking-room, his heavy face flushed with an old, well-rehearsed grievance. The cotton warehouse scheme was sound enough on paper, and I have never doubted that Harker altered the survey figures we showed our investors, knowing the ground was unsuitable, so that he might quietly sell his own share before the collapse, and leave the rest of us to explain the losses. You never brought an action against him. An action wants proof, Mr. Holmes, and Harker was a magistrate himself, with friends enough on every bench in Bombay to make any action I might have brought appear the sour grapes of a disappointed partner rather than honest justice. I contented myself with disliking him at a distance for 8 years, and I confess I felt no grief at all on hearing of his death, whatever face I have been obliged to wear at the dinner table since. Holmes pressed him gently on the night itself, and Carrow's account, checked afterward against 3 independent witnesses at the whist table, held without the smallest flaw, a fact that seemed, if anything, faintly to disappoint the man himself, as though he would rather have been thought capable of the deed than proven so thoroughly incapable of it. An old grievance kept at a comfortable distance for 8 years, Watson, rarely produces murder, Holmes remarked afterward, as we walked the deck in the last grey light of that evening. It is the grievance nursed in close and helpless silence, a boy's grief, allowed no outlet at all for 14 years, that finally curdles into something a man is willing to act upon. Carow has had his whist tables and his port, and his comfortable dislike to sustain him. Whoever killed Sir Julius Harker had nothing at all to sustain him but the waiting itself. It was on that same walk that I found myself telling Holmes, unprompted and rather to my own surprise, something of my own years in Afghanistan, of the particular, helpless anger a man carries home from a campaign that cost him a friend or two and answered none of the questions it seemed, at the time, so urgently to raise. I do not know quite what prompted the confidence, save perhaps the grey Atlantic evening and the case's own unhappy subject. But Holmes heard me out in unusual silence, and said, when I had finished, only that he understood a good deal better, for my having told him, why some men's angers fade with the years, and others do not. You came home to a profession, Watson, and a wife, and a friend fool enough to drag you into an eccentric bachelor's chemical experiments at all hours. A life crowded enough, in its way, to leave old grief rather less room to grow undisturbed. A boy who loses his whole family and is left, at 12, with nothing whatever to fill the silence but his own thoughts, grows a very different kind of anger indeed, and I begin to suspect we shall find exactly such a boy, grown now into a man, somewhere close at hand aboard this ship. We spoke, too, that evening of the ship's chaplain services, which Dr. Sutter, I recalled upon reflection, had attended punctually every Sunday morning of the voyage thus far, a small, ordinary piety that struck me, at the time, as nothing more than the mild habit of a conscientious professional man, and which I only came, very much later, to read as something considerably more troubled. The careful, ritual observance of a man who perhaps still hoped, in some quiet corner of himself, that his God had not yet entirely abandoned him to what he meant to do. Holmes made no comment on the chaplaincy attendance at the time, though I noticed, reviewing my own notes of the case long afterward, that he had recorded it in his private notebook the very same evening, beside a small question mark that I have never been quite able to interpret to my own full satisfaction. Chapter 12. The Surgeon's Hands. Holmes asked, that same evening, to examine Dr. Sutter's own surgical case, a request the doctor granted without apparent hesitation, laying the neat leather roll open upon his cabin table with the pride any careful professional takes in well-kept instruments. I watched Holmes's long fingers move over the scalpels, the probes, the small steel forceps nested in their velvet slots, and I saw him pause, very briefly, over a slender pair with a particular curved, narrow jaw, before passing on as though he had noticed nothing at all. "A fine set," Holmes said pleasantly. "Edinburgh work, I think, by the maker's mark." "My old teacher's gift when I qualified," Sutter said. "I have carried them ever since." "You have had cause to use the small curved forceps recently, I think," Holmes remarked, still in that same easy conversational tone. "There is a faint film upon the jaw, brass, unless I am much mistaken, rather than the usual traces of your professional work." It was the first time I had seen Dr. Sutter's composure waver in any visible way. He recovered himself within a second, and said only that he had used the instrument, the previous week, to retrieve a small screw fallen behind a fixed cabinet in the ship's dispensary, an explanation reasonable enough on its face, and offered smoothly enough that I might have believed it entirely, had I not seen Holmes's eyes narrow very slightly at the words. We left the surgeon's cabin a few minutes later, and Holmes said nothing at all until we had gained the deck and the cold night air. "Brass filings on a surgeon's forceps, Watson, from a lock rather than a cabinet screw. I would stake a good deal on it. A key turned from outside a locked door, using an instrument slender enough to reach the barrel through an old-fashioned keyhole and grip it firmly enough to turn it, leaves exactly such a trace, and no other honest use of a surgeon's forceps that I can readily imagine would leave quite that particular film." "You believe it is Sutter, then?" "I believe it is very probably Sutter, but belief is not proof, and I have as yet no shred of evidence that would satisfy a court, or even satisfy Inspector Grayle, who requires his evidence delivered a good deal more plainly than mine generally arrives. What I lack, Watson, is a motive I can point to, and a moment I can catch him in." It was the mention of motive that sent Holmes, an hour later, back to Mrs. Fenwick's cabin, with a question that had plainly been forming in his mind since our conversation with Sutter that afternoon. "The younger Wren brother," Holmes asked her, "the boy who left India rather than live under his family's disgraced name, do you know, even roughly, how old he would have been in '85? Mrs. Fenwick considered. "A boy of perhaps 12 or 13, I believe, when the trial was held. Old enough to understand what was happening to his family, and never to forget it, I should imagine." "A boy of 12 or 13 in '85, Holmes said slowly, half to himself, would be a man of some 26 or 27 now, very near, I think, Dr. Sutter's own age." Chapter 13. A face half-remembered confirmation. When it came, arrived by so small and human a door that I have often thought since how easily it might never have opened at all. Mrs. Fenwick, turning out an old writing case of her uncle's at Holmes's request, for he had asked her to search once more for any family photographs from the Bombay years, however faded or discarded, came upon a small, cracked daguerreotype, tucked behind a lining her uncle had evidently forgotten, or preferred to forget. It showed a family group of 5, stiffly posed in the fashion of some 15 years before. A stern-faced older woman, a young man of 21 or 22, who could only be the elder brother, Aldous Wren himself, and beside him a boy of 11 or 12, thin, dark-eyed, watching the camera with an intensity unusual in so young a face. Holmes studied that boy's face for a long time by lamplight, comparing it, feature by feature, against his memory of Dr. Miles Sutter's own countenance, and at last passed the little photograph to me without a word. I confess I could not at first sight be certain. A boy of 11 and a man of 26 are not always easy to reconcile in a single glance. But the set of the brow was there, and something in the watchfulness of the eyes that photography, even at its clumsiest, sometimes manages to preserve across the years. "It is enough for my own satisfaction, Watson, though I grant it would not yet satisfy a jury," Holmes said, "but it fits every other thread we have gathered, and I have long since ceased to trust in coincidence when so many small facts point, independently, in a single direction." He questioned Mrs. Fenwick further, and learned that the family, so far as she had ever heard her uncle mention it, had left India for England within the year of the trial, and that nothing further had ever reached her uncle's ears of their fate. A silence, Holmes observed, that a proud and guilty man might easily mistake for the world having forgotten, when in truth it meant only that the world had never been watching to begin with. He believed himself safe, Watson, because no threat had reached him in 14 years. He did not reckon on a boy who spent those 14 years becoming a physician, adopting a new name, and waiting, with a patience I confess I find almost admirable in its coldness, for the one voyage on which his old judge might be delivered into a space as confined and as private as an ocean liner's passenger list. I asked him how Sutter could possibly have arranged to be aboard the very ship Sir Julius Harker chose for his own passage home. A man determined enough and patient enough might watch a family's movements for years without ever once revealing himself, Watson. It would want only the purchase of a ship's surgeon's post aboard a likely vessel, and the ordinary patience to wait until his quarry's own affairs brought him at last to book a passage on it. Not so very difficult a thing to arrange, for a man with medical qualifications and no family left to ask him awkward questions about where he has been, or why. I asked Holmes, as he folded the small daguerreotype carefully back into its paper wrapping, whether he did not find something almost unbearably sad in the picture itself, a family posed so stiffly and so hopefully for the camera, entirely unaware of the ruin waiting for them within the year. "I find a great deal that is sad in this case altogether, Watson, and I do not think I have ever less enjoyed being right about a murderer's identity than I expect to enjoy it here. But sadness is not evidence, and I must set the one aside carefully from the other, or I shall be of no use at all to Mrs. Fenwick, who deserves the truth delivered clearly, whatever private grief it costs me to deliver it." It remained, Holmes said, only to prove it, and to do so before Sutter, sensing the net drawing closer, found occasion to strike a third time. Chapter 14. The Reconstruction. Holmes gathered, that evening, every scrap of testimony the voyage had yet produced, and spread it before me on our cabin table, like a hand of cards he meant to play only once, and play correctly. "Let us build the night itself, Watson, minute by minute, and see where the pieces refuse to sit comfortably together." Doggett had served Sir Julius his usual glass of soda water at 9:30, and found him then in his ordinary temper, if a little subdued following his quarrel with Vane over cards not half an hour before. Vane himself was accounted for from 9:45 onward, drinking alone and loudly aggrieved in the smoking room, watched by no fewer than 3 separate witnesses until well past 11. Doggett's second visit, the one at 10:30, with a further glass of soda water Sir Julius had rung for, was the visit upon which the whole case, Holmes said, most delicately turned. "You spoke to him through the door, you say, and did not see his face." "I did, sir. He called out that he'd changed his mind and didn't want it after all, and to take it away and not trouble him further. Short-tempered he sounded, but no more than a man does after losing at cards. Would you swear it was his voice, Doggett, beyond any doubt at all? The steward hesitated for the first time in all his tellings of that night. It was thick, sir, and a bit slurred, now you press me on it. I took it for drink. Or, said Holmes quietly, for a man already deep in the grip of a powerful drug, roused just enough by a knock to mumble a few words in a voice thick enough to pass for his own, before sinking back into a stupor from which he never woke at all. He turned next to the movements of Dr. Sutter that same evening, which the surgeon himself had accounted for readily enough. An early supper alone, an hour in the ship's small dispensary attending to a seasick child, and an early retirement to his own cabin by 10 o'clock, corroborated only by his own word, for a ship's surgeon keeps no steward to watch his comings and goings as a passenger does. There, Watson, is our gap, Holmes said, between 9:30, when Doggett last saw Sir Julius plainly awake and himself, and some hour before midnight, when the man was certainly dead or dying. Dr. Sutter's whereabouts rest upon nothing but Dr. Sutter's own assurance. He reconstructed piece by piece how it might have been done, a dose of some swift and powerful poison, not the chloral itself, which he now believed had been added afterward, in a smaller, corroborating measure, to muddy the surgeon's own later verdict, administered perhaps in the soda water itself, or in some sweet or cordial Sir Julius habitually took before sleep, delivered by a hand Sir Julius had no earthly reason to suspect. For what victim fears his own ship's physician? A physician, moreover, whom Sir Julius Harker had almost certainly never once looked at closely enough, across a crowded dining saloon, to recognize the grown face of a boy he had glimpsed only briefly, 14 years before, weeping in a Bombay courtroom gallery, while his brother was led away in irons. I asked whether he meant to confront Sutter directly with this reconstruction, and Holmes shook his head firmly. Not yet, Watson. A man clever enough to plan 14 years for his revenge will not crumble before a theory, however neatly built. I must catch him in an act, not merely in a story, and for that I shall want a trap, rather better baited than mere accusation. Chapter 15. The Key and the Keyhole. To prove what he suspected of the locked cabin itself, Holmes conducted, the following afternoon, a small and private demonstration for my benefit alone, in the corridor outside cabin 9, which remained sealed and empty since the discovery of the body. He had procured, from among the ship's own stores, a pair of slender curved forceps, not unlike those in Dr. Sutter's own case, and a spare key of the old teak cabin pattern common to the ship's older staterooms. Observe, Watson, the key stands in the lock, turned, as it stood when the door was broken open. I close the door now, upon the empty room, and turn the key from the inside, as any ordinary man locks himself in for the night. He did so, then stepped back into the corridor, knelt before the door, and inserted the narrow jaws of the forceps into the generous old keyhole with a delicacy I had rarely seen even in his most careful chemical work. It took him, by my own watch, a little under a minute to find the purchase he wanted upon the key's barrel, and perhaps 20 seconds more of steady, patient pressure before I heard, quite distinctly, the small definite click of the lock turning, from the outside, upon a key never touched by any hand but his own within the room. There, Watson. A trick as old as locksmithing itself, requiring nothing more than a steady hand, a suitable instrument, and the particular generosity of an old-fashioned keyhole such as ships built 20 years ago still commonly carry, though modern hotels have mostly closed the trick off with narrower locks. Any man might learn it in an evening's practice. A surgeon whose hands are trained daily to steadiness under far more delicate demands would find it almost trivially easy. Then he entered while Sir Julius already lay dying from the poison, administered the smaller dose of chloral to muddy the true cause, folded the dead man's hands upon the counterpane, arranged his spectacles with that same careful hand, and let himself out again, locking the door behind him by this same trick, leaving a locked room and an apparently natural death for us to puzzle over. Precisely so. It is, I think, the coldest part of the whole affair, Watson, that small, tender arrangement of the dead man's hands and spectacles. A murderer in a rage does not pause to fold his victim's hands so neatly. Only a man who has waited 14 years, and who feels, I believe, something closer to a grim ceremony than to ordinary murder, troubles himself with such a final touch. I asked him whether this demonstration, convincing as it was to my own eye, would satisfy Inspector Grayle any better than his earlier reasoning had done. It proves the door could have been locked so, Watson. It does not yet prove that Sutter, and no other man aboard with steady hands and a similar instrument, actually did it. Grayle will want the man's own confession, or something very near it, and I confess I want rather more than proof enough to satisfy Grayle. I want the truth spoken plainly, by the man himself, so that Mrs. Fenwick may know, beyond any lingering doubt, precisely what was done to her uncle and why. He was thoughtful and silent for the remainder of that afternoon, and I knew, from long experience of his moods, that he was already turning over in his mind the shape of whatever trap he meant to lay. Chapter 16. A Maid's Recollection. It was Nora Quill, Mrs. Fenwick's own quiet, sharp-eyed maid, who supplied, quite without meaning to, the final small confirmation Holmes wanted of his reconstructed timeline, and she did so in a manner so unassuming that I think even Holmes was a little surprised at how readily the truth came to him once he had thought to ask the right question of the right person. She had been pressed twice already by Inspector Grayle, in his early enthusiasm for Vane's guilt, and had told him each time only that she had seen nothing at all remarkable on the night in question, having spent the whole evening about her mistress's own cabin, 2 doors down from Sir Julius's, mending a torn hem by lamplight. Holmes, questioning her a third time with a gentleness Grayle had not troubled to employ, asked her not what she had seen, but what she had heard, a distinction, he told me afterward, that had unlocked more honest testimony from frightened witnesses in his long experience than any number of pointed questions about sights and faces. I heard the surgeon's step in the corridor a little before 9, sir, going toward Sir Julius's door, and I thought nothing of it at the time, for gentlemen of that age are forever wanting a tonic or a draught for their digestion after a heavy supper, and Dr. Sutter's step is a light, quick one I had come to know well enough by the 4th day of the crossing. You are certain of the hour? The saloon clock had struck the 3/4 not 2 minutes before, sir, for I heard it plain through my open door, and I recall thinking I should finish my mending before the hour struck, so as not to keep my mistress waiting for her own lamp. And you heard him leave again? Within a very few minutes, sir, no more than 5, I should think, though I confess I did not watch a clock for that particular purpose. I heard his step going back the way he had come, light and unhurried as ever, and thought nothing more of it until all this dreadful business began. It was, Holmes told me afterward, exactly the small, unregarded fact he had hoped some patient witness might eventually supply, an independent hour, fixed by an honest ear rather than by any theory of his own, confirming beyond reasonable doubt that Dr. Sutter had been at Sir Julius Harker's door within minutes of 9 o'clock, at almost precisely the hour the abandoned letter and the untouched pipe both now suggested the poison had first taken hold. A single witness's recollection is a fragile thing to build a case upon, Watson, and I would not care to stand before a jury with Nora Quill's ear alone as my evidence. But fragile threads, gathered patiently enough and woven together, make as strong a rope as any single stout cable, and I begin to think I have gathered threads enough now to hang a very strong rope indeed, wanting only the final proof that will make a confession, rather than a conviction by inference, the surer road to the whole truth. He thanked Nora Quill with a courtesy that plainly startled her, accustomed as she was to Grayle's brisker and less patient manner, and it was, I noted with some private amusement, the girl's own account, repeated afterward to Mrs. Fenwick in the strictest confidence. That first spread through the ship's below-deck society the rumour that the great detective suspected the surgeon himself, a rumour that reached, within a day, even the dispensary, in which Dr. Sutter went about his ordinary professional duties, with an outward calm that Holmes, watching him closely across the dining saloon that same evening, professed himself almost unwillingly to admire. A remarkable composure, Watson, for a man who must by now suspect, whatever precise words have or have not reached his own ears, that the net is drawing steadily closer about him. I confess I do not know whether to call it courage, or merely the exhaustion of 14 years' concealment, settling at last into a kind of weary readiness for the end, whatever form that end may take. Chapter 17. Vane cleared Inspector Grayle, informed that evening of Holmes's suspicions regarding Dr. Sutter, received the theory with an ill grace that did him little credit, for he had staked a good deal of his own professional pride upon Corrin Vane's guilt, and did not relish having built so publicly upon so mistaken a foundation. A surgeon, Mr. Holmes. You ask me to believe that a man who has treated half this ship for seasickness these 4 days past is in truth a murderer nursing a 14-year grudge, upon the strength of a stopped watch and a scratched pair of forceps. I ask you to believe nothing yet, Inspector. I ask only that you release Mr. Vane from his confinement, since he can no more have broken poor Marsh's neck upon the lower deck than you or I, being watched by 3 witnesses in the smoking room at the very hour it must have happened, and that you turn your own considerable energies toward confirming, independently of my own reasoning, exactly where Dr. Sutter was between 9:30 and midnight on the night Sir Julius died. Vane was released within the hour, and received the news with a bitterness he made no effort to disguise. For 4 days' confinement, however brief in the reckoning of a longer voyage, sit poorly with a proud man's temper. I hope, Mr. Holmes, that you mean to make a rather fuller public apology for my treatment than a mere unlocked door, he said, and Holmes, with unusual patience, assured him that the truth, when it emerged, would clear his name as thoroughly in the eyes of the ship's company as suspicion had lately blackened it. Grayle's independent inquiries, conducted that same evening with a thoroughness born partly of wounded pride and partly of genuine professional conscience, produced results that surprised even him. No steward, no passenger, no member of the crew could be found who had seen Dr. Sutter at any point between 9:30, when he was last observed leaving the dispensary, and shortly before midnight, when he answered a summons to a seasick passenger in the second-class cabins, a gap of very nearly 2.5 hours, entirely unaccounted for by any word but the surgeon's own. It proves nothing outright, Grayle admitted to Holmes that night, with rather better grace than before, but I'll grant you it wants explaining, and a man with nothing to hide generally explains such gaps rather more readily than Dr. Sutter has troubled to do. Holmes, for his part, had spent that same evening quietly cultivating, with Mrs. Fenwick's reluctant assistance, the particular rumour he intended should carry his trap to its conclusion, a rumour, whispered first to a steward, and thence, as such things travel upon a small ship, to nearly every ear aboard within a matter of hours, that Hugh Marsh had kept, besides whatever object he had found, a small pocket diary in which he had jotted, in his own rough hand, a description of the person he had glimpsed leaving Sir Julius Harker's corridor on the night of the murder, a diary that had, by great good fortune, survived the search of his locker, tucked inside the lining of an old coat, and was even now being carefully transcribed by the captain's own clerk. It was, Holmes admitted to me privately, entirely an invention. No such diary existed, nor had ever existed. But it was, he judged, exactly the kind of danger that would prove impossible for a cornered man to ignore. Chapter 18. Something Missing. Holmes returned to cabin 9 one final time that same afternoon, alone save for myself, to satisfy himself upon a point that had nagged at him, he admitted, since his very first examination of the room. A room tells you as much by what is absent from it, Watson, as by what remains, and I have not yet asked myself carefully enough what ought to have been in this cabin and was not. He went again through the dead man's effects with his lens, slower now than before, and paused longest over the small dressing shelf where Sir Julius's spectacles had been found so carefully folded. His tobacco pouch, Watson. Do you recall Mrs. Fenwick's account of her uncle's habits? A pipe, always, the last thing before he wound his watch and settled to sleep, a habit as fixed in its way as the winding itself. I did recall it, dimly, from one of our earlier conversations with the niece, and I saw at once what troubled Holmes upon finding the pouch itself. Examined now for the first time with proper care, still heavy with its full measure of tobacco, the little clay pipe beside it cold and entirely unused. A man does not break 2 fixed habits in a single evening by simple carelessness, Watson. He does not forget both his pipe and his watch, unless something interrupts him a good deal earlier in his evening's ritual than either Doggett's account or our own first assumptions allowed. Earlier, I now think, than even I first calculated. He knelt by the small writing desk bolted to the cabin wall and drew out, from beneath its blotting pad, a single sheet of ship's notepaper bearing the faint, ghostly impression of writing pressed through from a page since removed. Sir Julius's own hand, Holmes judged from the fragments legible under his lens, beginning what appeared to be the opening lines of a letter, abandoned after no more than a dozen words. He was writing, Watson, when whatever befell him first began to take hold. A letter begun and never finished. The pen, very probably still in his hand, when the drug's first effects reached him strongly enough to end the evening's ordinary business entirely. This places the poison's first effect a good deal earlier than 9:30, when Doggett last saw him composed enough to quarrel comfortably over a lost hand of cards, nearer, I now think, to 9 o'clock itself, very soon after Doggett's very first visit that evening, with the ordinary supper tray. Then the poison was given even earlier than we supposed. It was given, I now believe, in the ordinary supper itself, rather than in the later soda water, which explains a small difficulty in my earlier reasoning that had troubled me without my quite admitting it to myself, namely, that the swiftest poisons a ship's dispensary is likely to hold generally show their first effect within the half-hour, not within the 2 hours my earlier theory required. Sir Julius's supper was served, according to the saloon steward's own account, a few minutes before 9. The abandoned letter, the untouched pipe, the unwound watch, all three now agree upon an hour of onset far closer to 9 than to 10:30, and the whole timeline of that evening must be reconsidered in its light. It was a small correction, in the end, to the shape of Holmes's reconstruction, rather than any alteration of his central conclusion, but I record it here because it illustrates, I think, better than almost anything else in the case, the particular quality of mind that set my friend apart from every other investigator I have known, his willingness. Even at the very edge of a solution he had already largely proved to his own satisfaction, to go back once more to the physical evidence itself and correct a small error rather than let it stand unexamined merely because the larger theory no longer depended upon it. A detective who will not correct his own small errors, Watson, cannot be trusted to have caught all his large ones either. I would rather stand here an hour longer over an abandoned letter and an untouched pipe than present Inspector Grayle with a reconstruction I know to contain even one avoidable flaw. The correction, small as it seemed, would prove to matter a good deal more than either of us then suspected, for it meant that whoever had carried Sir Julius Harker's supper tray to his cabin that evening, a duty that fell, we learned within the hour, not to dog it at all on that particular occasion, but to a relief steward standing in for him while he attended to a seasick family in the second-class quarters, held the true key to the poisoning's opening act. And it was this discovery, followed swiftly to its source, that led Holmes directly to the dispensary record, confirming Dr. Sutter had personally prepared a tonic for Sir Julius that same evening, at the surgeon's own quiet suggestion, ostensibly to settle a stomach unsettled by the day's rough crossing. Chapter 19. The Bombay Ledger. Confirmation of a rather different and more concrete kind reached us that same night. By wireless telegraphy from the shore stations the Caledonic had lately come within range of. In response to inquiries Holmes had quietly set in motion through the captain 3 days before, the moment Mrs. Fenwick had first named the Wren case to him. The telegram, forwarded from a solicitor's office in London that had once handled certain of the Wren family's affairs, confirmed what Holmes had already reasoned from a faded photograph and a face half-remembered, that Aldous Wren, convicted in Bombay in 1885 upon the testimony and judgment of Sir Julius Harker, had died in a penal settlement some 6 years into his sentence, broken in health. That his mother had died within a year of the trial, by most accounts of grief and disgraced poverty together, and that the younger brother, one Miles Wren, aged 12 at the time of the trial, had emigrated to Scotland under his mother's maiden name shortly after her death, and had, so far as the solicitor's old records showed, later taken up the study of medicine at Edinburgh. Miles Wren, Watson, becomes Miles Sutter, and Edinburgh medical training becomes the very qualification that placed him, ready and waiting, in exactly the profession that would one day let him step aboard this ship, examine the body of the man who destroyed his family, and pronounce it a natural death with his own steady hand. He read the telegram through twice more, and there was, for the only time in the whole affair, something almost like pity in his voice as he spoke. A boy of 12, forced to watch his brother led away in irons and his mother buried within the year, does not become a murderer by wickedness alone, Watson. He becomes one by a long and patient cultivation of grief into purpose, year upon year, until the purpose is all that remains of the grief, and the man who inflicted it has become, in his mind, not a fellow human being any longer, but simply a debt that must at last be collected. You pity him. I understand him, which is not quite the same thing, and understanding him does not for one moment excuse the broken neck of poor Hugh Marsh, who had done Miles Wren no wrong at all, beyond the misfortune of finding, and meaning to sell, some small proof of what had been done in cabin 9. Whatever grief made the man, Watson, whatever justice he believes himself to be serving, he has now killed twice, and shown himself willing, I think, to kill a third time without much hesitation, if he judges it necessary to his own safety. It was this last consideration, more than any other, that decided Holmes to spring his trap without further delay, for the invented diary, once loosed upon the ship's gossip, could not safely be left circulating a moment longer than necessary, lest it provoke the very violence it was designed to draw out into the open. He sent word that evening, through channels he was careful not to explain even to me, that the captain's clerk had very nearly finished his transcription of Hugh Marsh's diary, and that it would be read aloud, in full, before the assembled first-class passengers and officers, at 11 o'clock the following night. Chapter 20. Holmes lays the snare. You mean to frighten him into acting, I said, as Holmes laid out, for my benefit alone, the shape of the trap he had built. But suppose he does nothing at all? Suppose he simply waits out the reading, and lets the invented diary reveal, as it must, that it never contained his description in the first place. He cannot risk waiting, Watson, and there lies the whole strength of the snare. Consider his position as he must see it tonight. He believes, or must at least fear, that a dead man's own hand has left behind some description of him leaving that corridor, a description that, whether accurate in every particular or not, places him at the very door of cabin 9 at an hour he has publicly denied being anywhere near it. He cannot know, until the reading itself, how damning or how vague that description proves to be. A man who has planned a murder for 14 years does not leave so large a risk untested. He will act tonight, before the reading, to see for himself exactly what threat he faces, either by attempting to reach the diary itself, wherever he believes it kept, or by seeking out whoever he supposes holds it. And where do you mean him to believe it kept? In the captain's own cabin, Watson, under lock, guarded, or so it will appear, by a single elderly steward posted outside. A man Sutter will judge, correctly enough, to be no very great obstacle to a determined intruder. I shall be within that cabin myself, in the dark, from 10 o'clock onward, and you, my dear fellow, if you are willing, at the head of the passage beyond, to see that no one leaves that corridor unremarked once he has entered it. I confess my blood ran a good deal colder at the prospect of that long, dark watch than at any polite deduction over the soup, but I told Holmes, as I had told him on 100 earlier occasions, that I would not for the world leave him to face a desperate and doubly murderous man alone in a darkened cabin. Mrs. Fenwick, informed only that Holmes required her cooperation in settling the matter finally, lent her own quiet assistance to spreading word, through her maid Nora Quill, that the captain intended to keep the diary locked in his own strong-box until the public reading, a detail calculated, Holmes judged, to fix precisely the location Sutter must attempt if he meant to act at all. We took up our positions a little before 10, the captain's cabin dark and silent, myself concealed in the shadow of the passage beyond with my old service revolver, a comforting weight in my coat pocket, and Holmes crouched motionless beside the captain's own desk within, waiting with a patience that never failed to astonish me, however many times I had shared such a vigil with him before. The ship's engines throbbed on beneath us, steady and unhurried, entirely indifferent to the small, tense drama unfolding 4 decks above the sea. And somewhere in that darkness, I knew, a man who had waited 14 years for his revenge was even now deciding, in whatever quiet turmoil occupied his mind, whether to risk everything upon a single desperate act before the following night's reading could expose him. Chapter 21. The Watch in the Dark. The waiting itself, I confess, tried my nerves a good deal more than any of the physical dangers I had faced at Holmes's side in earlier cases. There is a particular quality to darkness aboard a ship at night, felt rather than seen. The endless small creakings of a great hull working against the sea, the distant muffled throb of engines that never quite ceases, the occasional footstep of some late passenger or watchful officer passing at the corridor's far end, and setting my heart racing before I had even properly identified the sound. I stood in my appointed shadow, with my revolver ready, and my collar suddenly too tight, and thought, more than once in that long hour, of Mrs. Fenwick's white face at the rail 9 days before, and of poor Hugh Marsh's broken neck, and wondered whether I had entirely reckoned with what manner of man we waited there to meet. The ship's bell sounded the half-hour, then the 3/4, each stroke carrying an eternity of silence in its wake, and I began, despite myself, to wonder whether Holmes's carefully planted rumour had after all failed to reach the one ear it was intended for, or reached it only to be judged, by a cooler head than we had credited, not worth so desperate a risk. I had very nearly resolved to creep forward and murmur as much through the darkened doorway to Holmes himself, when the change came at last in the quality of shadow at the corridor's far end that told me our long vigil was not, after all, to end in disappointment. It was some minutes past 11 when I heard it. Not a footstep exactly, for the man moved with a care that left almost no sound at all upon the carpeted passage, but a faint change in the quality of the darkness at the corridor's far end, a shape detaching itself from shadow and moving with slow, deliberate purpose toward the captain's door. I held my place as Holmes had instructed, my revolver ready but lowered, my breath as quiet as I could make it, and watched the shape pause outside the door, listen for a long moment, and then bend to the lock with movements I recognized at once, having watched Holmes perform the very same trick not 2 days before. The click, when it came, was barely audible, but it seemed to me, in that tense silence, as loud as a pistol shot. The door swung inward, and the shape passed through it into darkness deeper still, and I gave him, as Holmes had asked, a full, slow count of 20 before I followed on soft feet to the threshold myself. What happened within I had largely by Holmes's own later account, though I heard enough of it myself, standing just beyond the door, to need little further telling. Dr. Sutter, for it was he, exactly as Holmes had reasoned, crossed directly to the captain's strongbox in the corner, and had, by Holmes's account, actually begun working upon its lock with a small steel implement, when Holmes's voice spoke out of the darkness beside him, perfectly level and entirely unhurried. "I would not trouble with that lock, Dr. Sutter. There is nothing within it that concerns you, and a good deal that concerns you very closely indeed, standing here in this cabin with me." I heard, from my place at the door, a sharp indrawn breath, and then the scrape of a struck match as Holmes calmly lit the cabin lamp, and I stepped through the doorway myself, in time to see Dr. Sutter standing frozen beside the strongbox, his steel pick still in his hand, his face, in that sudden light, gone the colour of old parchment. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice, usually so mild and level, shook badly on the two words. "This is not. I can explain my presence here. I am entirely certain you can, Doctor, and I confess I am rather more interested in that explanation than in the pretense of a diary you came here believing you must silence or destroy. There is no diary, Dr. Sutter. There never was one. Hugh Marsh died with whatever he had found still upon his person, or hidden elsewhere entirely, and the danger you have risked everything tonight to escape was never anything more than a story I invented 3 days ago, to see what a guilty man might be driven to attempt when he believed himself finally cornered. I have rarely, in all our years together, seen a man's composure collapse so completely and so quickly as Dr. Sutter's collapsed in that lamplit cabin. He set down the little steel pick upon the captain's desk with the careful, deliberate motion of a man whose hands have suddenly begun to fail him, and lowered himself, without being asked, into the chair beside it, his face in his hands. "You know, then," he said at last, in a voice from which every trace of his ordinary professional mildness had entirely drained away. "You know all of it." "I know a very great deal of it, Mr. Wren," Holmes said, quietly, but without any softening of the name, "and I think it would go rather better for you, and very much better for the peace of mind of a young woman who has done you no wrong at all, if you were to tell me the rest yourself, plainly, rather than force me to lay it out piece by piece, before witnesses who will judge you far less gently than I am inclined to do tonight." I had, by then, sent word by a passing steward for Captain Aldous and Inspector Grail both, and it was in their presence, some 10 minutes later, crowded into that small lamplit cabin with the strongbox still standing open and unransacked beside him, that Miles Wren, for he did not, from that moment forward, attempt to call himself Sutter again, began, haltingly at first, and then, with a kind of terrible unburdening fluency, to tell the whole of it. Chapter 22. The Reveal. "I was 12 years old," he began, "when I watched my brother stand in the dock at Bombay, and Sir Julius Harker, in his robes and his wig, tell a courtroom full of strangers that Aldous Wren was a thief and a liar, and sentence him to a term of years that everyone in that room knew, and Harker knew best of all, would very probably kill him before he ever saw England again. He spoke for some time of his brother, a clever, ambitious young clerk who had, Wren insisted even now, done nothing more criminal than uncover, in the trading house's own ledgers, evidence of embezzlement committed not by himself, but by men very much better connected than a junior clerk, men whose friendship Sir Julius Harker had valued a good deal more than he valued the truth of a case laid plainly enough before him, had he cared to look. My brother went to the authorities with what he had found, Mr. Holmes, and within the month found himself charged with the very crime he had discovered. The ledgers he meant to expose conveniently altered to point at his own hand instead, and Harker, who I have since had reason to believe was paid very handsomely indeed for his trouble, presided over the trial that buried both the truth and my brother together. Holmes asked him, gently but directly, whether he had proof of this now, so many years after, or whether it remained, even to himself, more conviction than certainty. I have spent 14 years gathering what proof a boy without money or standing could gather, Mr. Holmes, a scrap here and a whispered confirmation there, from clerks grown old and willing at last to speak what they dared not say at the time. I have enough, I believe, to satisfy any honest court, though I never meant to bring it before a court at all. My mother did not live to see even the appeal denied. She died believing her elder son a thief, because the world told her so with such perfect official confidence, and I have never in 14 years found a way to forgive the man who told that lie so convincingly that even she believed it. He described, in a voice grown steadily quieter as the telling went on, how he had left India within the year, taken his mother's maiden name of Sutter to escape the shadow of his brother's disgrace, and set himself, with a single-minded patience that even now seemed to frighten him a little in the telling, to the study of medicine, not from any love of the profession itself, he admitted, but because a ship's surgeon travels where he chooses, and asks and is asked very few awkward questions about his past. I watched for Sir Julius Harker's movements for years, Mr. Holmes, through agents I paid discreetly and never met twice, until I learned, this past spring, that he had at last decided to retire from Bombay and take passage home. I secured this post aboard the Caledonic 8 months ago on the strength of a forged reference and a genuine qualification, and I waited, as patiently as I have waited for everything else in these 14 years, until his own booking confirmed which crossing he would take. Holmes asked him, then, to account for the night itself, and Wren did so with a terrible, methodical calm that seemed almost worse to my ear than any display of passion would have been. I had access, as ship's surgeon, to a preparation a good deal swifter and surer than chloral, which I administered in the soda-water Doggett himself carried to his cabin at 9:30, having intercepted the tray, as I had contrived to do on 2 earlier evenings first, so that my handling of it that particular night should draw no special notice from anyone who happened to observe it. I waited in the corridor until Doggett's second visit at 10:30, and answered through the door myself, in as close an imitation of Sir Julius's voice as I could manage in that thick, sleepy register, having practised the trick of his speech for some weeks beforehand. In private, from recordings of his voice, I had made no secret to myself of gathering. And the lock, Holmes said, a trick my brother himself once showed me, as a boy, from an old locksmith's manual he had borrowed for the sheer curiosity of it, in the last summer before his arrest. I have thought of it, Mr. Holmes, at least once a week for 14 years, without ever imagining I should have occasion to use it in earnest. Chapter 23. Confession at Sea. It was Hugh Marsh's death that seemed to weigh most heavily upon him, once the central confession had been made, and his composure, so carefully maintained through the account of Sir Julius's own death, broke entirely at last, when Holmes pressed him gently upon it. "I did not plan that, Mr. Holmes, whatever else I planned with such care. Marsh came to me himself 2 days after Sir Julius died, and told me, thinking me merely a fellow professional he might trust with the delicate matter, that he had found a cuff-link beneath the corridor carpet outside cabin 9, engraved with initials that were not Sir Julius's own, and asked whether I thought it worth reporting, or worth rather more quietly turning to his own advantage first. He had recognized the cuff-link at once, he said, as his own, dropped, unnoticed, in the darkness of that corridor on the night of the murder, a small, careless slip in 14 years of otherwise perfect planning. I told him I would think the matter over, and speak with him again the following evening, and I spent that day in something very near despair, Mr. Holmes, turning over in my mind every possible way of recovering that cuff-link without violence, and finding none that seemed to answer. When I met him again upon the lower deck, meaning only, I told myself to buy his silence outright with whatever money I could raise, he named a sum so far beyond anything I possessed that I understood at once he meant to go on bleeding me for as long as I lived, or else betray me the moment my payments failed to satisfy him. "And so you killed him?" "I did not decide it beforehand, if that is any defence at all, which I do not for a moment suppose it is. Something in me simply acted, Mr. Holmes, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, before I had properly thought at all. The same something, I have come slowly to understand this past week, that killed Sir Julius Harker with such careful, deliberate calm, 14 years in the planning. I had told myself all these years that I was a patient, reasoning man pursuing a patient, reasoning justice. I understand now that I had simply become, somewhere in all that waiting, a man capable of killing quickly and without much thought at all, the moment killing seemed to serve my safety. He searched Marsh's locker himself that same night, he admitted, recovering the cuff-link and disturbing the rest of the young trimmer's few belongings, in his haste to be certain nothing else remained that might connect him to the corridor outside cabin 9. Captain Aldous, listening to this final confession, with a face grown steadily greyer as it proceeded, asked him at last, in a voice heavy with something between anger and a reluctant, troubled pity, whether he felt any remorse at all for what he had done. "I feel remorse enough for Hugh Marsh, Captain, who had done nothing to deserve dying at my hand beyond the misfortune of finding a dropped cuff-link he could not have known the weight of. For Sir Julius Harker, I confess I feel a good deal less, though I have begun tonight, for the first time in 14 years, to wonder whether the boy who watched his brother led away in irons would recognize, or forgive, the man that boy's grief eventually made of him." Inspector Grail, recovering at last his professional footing after the shock of so full and unexpected a confession, placed Miles Wren formally under arrest before the small, silent company assembled in that cabin, and Wren submitted to it without the smallest resistance, seeming, if anything, almost relieved to have the long 14 years of careful concealment finally at an end. Chapter 24. Aftermath, in grey light. Mrs. Fenwick received the full account the following morning, from Holmes's own lips, with a composure that surprised even the captain, who had expected, I think, a good deal more weeping than she actually gave way to. "I am sorry for him, in a strange way, Mr. Holmes," she said, when Holmes had finished, "though I do not think I can ever quite forgive him for Hugh Marsh, who seems to me the truest victim in the whole dreadful business, a young man who wanted nothing more than a little money, and paid for that small greed with his life." "You need feel no obligation to forgive either death, Mrs. Fenwick," Holmes told her gently. "Understanding a man's history is not the same as excusing what his history led him to do, and I would not have you mistake the one for the other on my account." She asked him, after a silence, whether her uncle's own conduct in Bombay, the false conviction, the ruined family, the payment Wren believed he had received for his part in it, troubled Holmes's conscience at all in the pursuit of justice for his death. "It troubles me a good deal, Mrs. Fenwick, and I will not pretend otherwise. Sir Julius Harker was, upon every account I have gathered these past days, a proud and not always an honest man, and the wrong done to the Wren family 14 years ago was, I believe, a real and grievous wrong, whatever comfort the law's slow processes may yet extend to that unhappy memory. But a wrong done 14 years ago does not become right by being answered with murder now, and 2 further lives, Hugh Marsh's, and very possibly your own had matters gone differently, were placed in a danger neither of them had earned, by a man who had convinced himself, across 14 patient years, that his own grief entitled him to be judge and executioner both." Corin Vane, informed at last of his complete exoneration, accepted Holmes's apology with rather better grace than his earlier bitterness had suggested he would manage, and even confessed, over a final evening's cards with Watson and myself, that he had rather enjoyed, in a perverse sort of way, being the object of so much dramatic suspicion. Mrs. Iris Wexley kept largely to her cabin for the remainder of the voyage, though she sought Mrs. Fenwick out once, briefly, to offer what comfort one woman who had known Sir Julius Harker's less admirable side might offer another who had loved him despite it. Second Officer Prynne's clandestine understanding with Mrs. Fenwick, no longer forbidden by any living authority, became within a fortnight of our own return to England a rather more open and settled engagement, a small, quiet happiness Holmes noted with something almost like satisfaction when word of it reached us by letter some months later. Inspector Grail, for his part, secured full credit in his own official report for the arrest, a small vanity Holmes bore with his usual weary tolerance, remarking only, when I protested on his behalf, that credit mattered a good deal less to him than the fact of the matter being properly and finally settled. The Caledonic came into New York Harbor 2 days later than her scheduled arrival, delayed by the formalities attending a prisoner and 2 bodies committed to the ship's care, and I remember standing at the rail beside Holmes as the grey Atlantic gave way at last to the crowded, hopeful skyline of the New World, thinking how strange it was that so much old, buried grief from a courtroom half a world away should have followed us across 3,000 miles of open water to find its ending here. Miles Wren was held by the American authorities only long enough to satisfy the formalities of his arrest upon a British vessel, and was returned to England within the month to stand trial for both deaths, the Caledonic being registered at Liverpool and her captain's own sworn account, together with Holmes's careful reconstruction, furnishing evidence enough that no serious question of jurisdiction troubled the proceedings. The trial itself, held at the Old Bailey the following spring, drew a curious echo of the very courtroom scene that had begun the whole tragedy 14 years before, though Holmes did not attend it, having no taste, as he told me, for watching twice in one lifetime what a courtroom does to a broken family. I attended in his place, and wrote him a full account that evening, which he read through once, in silence, and set aside without comment beyond a single observation that the law, however carefully applied, seldom manages to weigh 14 years of grief upon the same scale as a single night's violence, and is very probably right not to try. Wren was convicted of both murders and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out that autumn with a quietness that seemed, in the newspaper's brief and unremarkable notices, almost indecent given the strange weight of history behind it. He wrote to Holmes once, in the last fortnight before his execution, a short letter that Holmes showed to me only years afterward, and which I have never felt at liberty to reproduce in full, save to say that it contained neither complaint nor plea for mercy, but only a plain, careful account of his brother's innocence, together with the names of 2 elderly Bombay clerks still living, who might, Wren believed, be persuaded at last to confirm it. Holmes pursued that final thread himself, quietly and without any public notice, in the months that followed, and secured, through channels I never fully learned, a formal acknowledgement from the Bombay judicial authorities that certain irregularities in the original embezzlement case of 1885 warranted a posthumous review of Aldous Wren's conviction, a review that concluded some 2 years after our own voyage with a quiet official notation restoring the family's name, for whatever comfort so belated and so cold a vindication could still offer to the dead. "It is not justice, Watson," Holmes said to me, the evening that final notice reached us by post at Baker Street. "For justice delayed 14 years and delivered only after 2 more deaths, and an execution can hardly deserve so fine a name. But it is truth at least, set down at last where any who care to look may find it. And I have come to believe, in my later years rather more than my earlier ones, that truth honestly established is very often the only comfort this world troubles itself to provide." Sir Julius Harker's own reputation did not long survive the fuller history that emerged during Wren's trial, and I understand Mrs. Fenwick found herself obliged, in the following season, to weather a good deal of unkind drawing-room speculation regarding an uncle she had, in her own heart, already mourned and judged with rather more honesty than London society generally troubled itself to manage. She wrote to us twice that year, once upon her marriage to Second Officer Prynne, who had by then left the sea for a shore appointment with the same line, and once, some years later still, upon the birth of a daughter, she told us, with a warmth that touched even Holmes, she meant to raise knowing nothing whatever of Bombay, and everything of kindness. Chapter 25. The Outro. "You are unusually quiet, Watson," Holmes observed, as the harbour pilot's boat drew alongside, and the great ship began, at last, to slow. "I was thinking of the boy in that daguerreotype," I admitted, "and wondering whether justice, in this case, has been served at all, or merely exchanged for a different, sadder variety of tragedy." "An excellent question, Watson, and one I confess I cannot answer with my usual confidence. Sir Julius Harker's crime went unpunished by any court for 14 years, and might have gone unpunished forever had a grieving boy not grown, slowly and terribly, into a man capable of punishing it himself. That the punishment fell, in the end, upon the wrong scale of justice entirely, private, murderous, and costing an innocent young sailor his life besides, does not erase the original wrong, but neither does the original wrong excuse what was done in its name. I find, when I consider the whole affair honestly, that I have very little appetite left for pronouncing which of the 2 men was the greater sinner. You are not often so uncertain, Holmes. I am not often asked to weigh a magistrate's corruption against a grieving brother's revenge, Watson, and I confess the scales balance rather less comfortably than the tidy sort of case I generally prefer, a case with one plain villain and one plain wrong, and no grey country in between. This was not such a case, and I am not sorry on the whole that it has taught me to be a little less certain than I was a fortnight ago. He was silent for a moment, watching the tugboats nose the great liner toward her berth, and then he permitted himself, at last, the small, dry smile I had come to know so well at the close of a difficult case. "Still," he said, "I do not doubt that London will furnish us some new puzzle within the month, Watson, and I confess I shall be glad enough of one with rather fewer grey corners to it. A straightforward theft, perhaps, or a tidy little forgery, with no 14-year grief behind it at all. You would be bored within a week of so simple a case, Holmes, and you know it." "Very probably," he admitted, and there was real warmth in his laugh. The first I had heard from him since Mrs. Fenwick first came to him white-faced at the rail, 9 long days before. "But I shall enjoy being bored a great deal more, Watson, after a fortnight such as this one, than I generally admit to enjoying anything at all." The gangway went down within the hour, and New York's noise and bustle rose up to meet us, entirely indifferent, as great cities always are, to the small and terrible history that had run its course upon the quiet Atlantic crossing, now ending behind us. A history that Sherlock Holmes himself, whatever else he later said of the case in his own dry, understated way, never spoke of again without that same small, uncharacteristic pause, as though some part of the grey country between right and wrong had followed him ashore after all, and never quite left him since.